delighted to be able to share this work with all of you. And this webinar is being hosted by the methods module of the CGR gender platform. And for those of you who are not familiar with the gender platform, this is a group within the CGR that aims to support research on gender across the CGR, but also with our partners. And the methods module is led by IFPRI, with Hazel Malapit and myself co-leading this module. The goal of the methods module is to make sure that gender researchers across the CGR, as well as our partners, have access to gender research methods and tools so that we can strengthen and facilitate high quality gender research. One of the key activities that we've been engaged in over the past year has been to form a set of working groups on priority research areas. And there are 7 of these working groups, and they include nutrition and health, institutions and governance, labor dynamics and time use, which we'll be hearing about today, agricultural value chains, markets, and entrepreneurship, gender sensitive design and delivery of agricultural technologies, gender transformative approaches, and climate change. And the purpose of each of the working groups was to do a review to synthesize and curate a set of available research methods and tools within that particular research area. And the tools and methods that these groups have collected will be added to the Gender Platforms Resource Hub in the form of a searchable database. And we also have working papers coming out that summarize the review that was done. So today we're going to be hearing about the results of the review that was done by the working group on labor dynamics and time use. This working group was led by Greg Seymour at IFPRI and Padmaja Ravula at ICRISAT. And so we're going to be hearing the results in a minute. I just want to mention before we get started that we are recording this session. And I'd like to ask all of you, if you have questions during the presentation, to please type these in the chat box, and we will have some time for a Q&A after the presentations have finished. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Padmaja Ravula is a senior scientist at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, ICRISAT, in India. She is a sociologist with 20 years of experience conducting interdisciplinary quantitative and qualitative research on issues related to gender, nutrition, social capital, and empowerment. Padmaja has a unique combination of expertise in nutrition and sociological research and has over 50 publications. She has a PhD in humanities and social sciences from the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. And Greg Seymour is a research fellow with the Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute, where Greg focuses his research on a range of issues related to gender and agriculture, time use, household survey methods and measurement, and climate change, among other things. He is a part of the team that developed various versions of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, including most recently the ProWEA, which is a project level version. And he has a PhD in economics from American University. So thank you so much for sharing your review results with us, and we look forward to your presentation. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let me share my screen. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody from wherever you're joining in. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, and I hope you can see the presentation also.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks for the nice introduction, Elizabeth. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Gender Platform and the Methods module for giving us this opportunity to do this work in collaboration with other team members also. And you can see that we have Vanya from the Alliance, as well as Ananya, who is also from ICRISAT, who is a part of this team. So I hope our presentation, which we've made it very succinct, would actually stimulate a rich discussion on this important topic of work and time use. And we also would like to mention that the paper would actually have all the details of the methods and the tools that we have reviewed. But here we are just going to present a flavor of some of the key points that we would like to share with everybody in the team. So without much ado, I'll start my presentation. So I'll do the first part, which focuses on gendered patterns of work, and then Greg will articulate more on the time use part of the paper. So this is my favorite slide, and I hope most of you must have seen this cartoon. So this picture conveys what today's presentation is all about. So labor is the main asset of the poor, and it is this asset which actually helps them to generate income depending upon their productivity, that is how much of work they're able to do and how much time they're able to spend on the different activities that they do. So in this presentation or in this paper, actually, we would like to actually understand or present to you how we understand the gendered patterns of work. So you see that she doesn't do any work. She's just a housewife. So how do we understand this gendered patterns of work and also time use, and also how do we capture this very correctly? So what are the different tools, methods that are existing, and what some innovations that we can make, and also stimulate some discussion on where the gaps are, so that we start thinking about what should be the next steps in this direction for this particular topic. So as I have said, rural women's time is most often undercounted, even in national statistics or international statistics. And most of the time, you could see that time is also an important resource for rural people, especially for women. And it is so demanding because of the multiple roles that they play. So, how do we actually understand this time as well as the patterns of work that women do? So, that's what this review is all about. And as I have already mentioned, so it focuses on agriculture related activities and allied activities. Towards the end, we would also like to share some methodological insights into the gender dimensions of rural work and time use, which will help in supporting, data collection efforts so that we can capture everything more properly and in real sense. Track progress on gender equality through employment, through time burdens, time equality, time poverty, etc. And this would also help guide in designing and implementing development interventions for gender research. Women are engaged in agriculture in various ways, as we all know that. So they can be engaged in subsistence production systems, like they work on their own farms or producing food, or they may also work on commercial agriculture. Similarly, they can be either working on their own farm, so they are self-employed with or without employees. They also are unpaid workers on family farms that I have already mentioned, and they may work as paid or unpaid labor on other farms and agricultural enterprises. So rural women are significantly more likely to engage in the production of foodstuffs for home consumption, and this work that may be critical for household food security, but that may put them at a higher economic vulnerability as well as influence their agency in the household and the community. Now, there is very limited, I shouldn't say very limited, but there is limited data that is available at the individual level, disaggregated by gender and age, especially when we look at the gendered work patterns. This part of the presentation will focus on the quantitative methods as well as the qualitative methods and tools for measurement of gendered patterns of work. And while I say that there is paucity of data at the individual level disaggregated by gender and age, even though there are a lot of studies there are a lot of surveys that capture these, but we see that many a times it's not always the case. Yes, there are times when there are occasions when employment work patterns are also understood, but the focus, in analyzing these survey data sometimes and most often tends to be looking at the final outcomes like poverty, food security, etc. And more so in the CGIR, I think, so where we researchers have focused more on food security, empowerment, and we have limited or less focus on intermediate outcomes like employment. So this is something that researchers have, CG, especially the social scientists and the gender researchers, should start thinking about to see how we can start working more on understanding the gendered work patterns, especially with the focus on, outcomes like employment, which are also very important alongside food security, reducing poverty, etc. Now, there, as I have said, there are a number of surveys that can, survey methods that are available, and we found that in our review. These help in, deepening our understanding of the work pattern. So here in this slide, I share a few of the quantitative survey methods. These include mostly the labor force surveys and the agricultural surveys. Now, the difference between the labor force surveys and the agricultural surveys is that the labor force survey is in the unit of analysis. The labor force surveys focus, their unit of analysis is at the household level, whereas for the agricultural surveys, the unit of analysis is on the agricultural holdings that the household may have. Now I would just like to present a few details about the labor force surveys. So the labor force surveys are one of the key sources of information about labor markets. They collect mostly quantitative, but sometimes also qualitative information about all types of work. Also, they collect information about the activity status and other labor market related data through household surveys. Since they collect data for each individual in the household, the indicators can be easily disaggregated by gender, age, place of work, sector of employment, etc. And these statistics are collected at regular intervals. Now, sometimes, similarly, like the labor force surveys, population censuses also collect labor data, but we must remember that census surveys are not collected very often. So sometimes there's a gap of 10 years or so, etc. And hence, we keep relying on the labor force surveys for understanding work patterns by gender. The disadvantages of the labor force surveys is that many a times they do not take into account unpaid activities. It's not that they always do not take into account, but many a times they do not take into account unpaid activities like work on their own farms, family farms, etc. But now these limitations have been well recognized, and there are various ongoing efforts to develop improved practices for the measurement of women's work, which focuses on the unpaid activities also. Now, similar to the labor force surveys, or as an add-on, you could say are the multi-topic living standard surveys. A good example is the LSMS or the LSMS ESA. They also collect all types of data. They collect data on all types of work, activities, data, market-related data. But what is interesting and what is important to note is also that they have a lot of methodological innovations in capturing and measuring women's work in agriculture. So the caveat in when we look at labor force surveys is the scope, the focus, and the objectives of the labor force survey. So these may be different, and hence there could be that in sometimes labor force surveys may not take into account the unpaid activities or the reproductive work, etc. The next set of surveys, the most important ones, are the agricultural surveys. While labor force surveys focus on measuring employment and work, agricultural surveys focus on gathering information on different types of crops that are cultivated, the income, productivity, yields, other activities, etc. But they also have a module on labor data, collecting labor data. But most of the times, just like the labor force surveys, agricultural surveys also borrow upon multiple frames of units. Sometimes they may use households, sometimes agricultural holdings, sometimes family to collect data on agriculture. Now, some examples of the agricultural surveys are like the village level studies or the village dynamic studies that have been a longitudinal study that has been conducted for more than 30 years. Another example is the FAO Agricultural Integrated Survey or the AGRIS survey. This is a multi-country survey, and it's a large-scale agricultural survey for establishing comprehensive and comparable data sets using international definitions and standards. Near the advantages of the labor force survey, the agricultural survey is that they collect data disaggregated by gender, and also many a times one of the disadvantages is they are complicated and they take longer time. Sometimes the interview takes a much longer time. Now let's go to the next slide. So this was a quick snapshot of the quantitative methods that we have reported in our review. There are more such methods, but we would just like to focus on you. So now moving on to the qualitative methods. So the qualitative methods actually complement the quantitative data that has been collected, because many a times we cannot capture the views of the women through the quantitative surveys. So the qualitative methodologies, if they are going on hand in hand with the quantitative surveys, they actually complement each other, and they would provide us a much more detailed understanding and the nuances of why and how and where women work, and what are the reasons sometimes for their low productivity or the productivity of the work. Especially keeping in view that many a times, many places, the patriarchal societies, the patriarchy dominates in many societies, and there are sometimes strict gender and social norms that prevent women from taking part in quantitative surveys. These qualitative methodologies, where we talk to women and we have a guided discussion and also a one-on-one discussion with them, actually helps us to understand better about the gendered work patterns. And this can also be quantified through several analytical methodologies that are available. Another interesting thing that we would like to also present is how women classify work themselves. Based on my work in India, I find that many a times when we ask what women are doing, they say, yeah, we just go to the field, do some weeding, and then we come back. That's it. They never take into account the work that they do for the family, that is the reproductive or the unpaid or the care work that they do. They don't treat that as work themselves. So if we really need to take into account, the time and the effort that women put into in a whole day, or during a season, or during a crop cycle, or even during a year, we really need to complement the quantitative data with the qualitative methodologies. Some examples of qualitative methodologies include, mapping tools or diagramming tools such as community resource maps, social maps, etc. Participatory rural tool appraisals such as transect walks, focus group discussions, seasonal calendars, and I'll come back to them later, especially the seasonal calendars. Then you have structured, semi-structured key informant interviews where you have a one-on-one conversation. And recently now we keep calling these key informant interviews also is the most significant change interviews. Like, if there is a woman in a community who has done some part of a work that actually brought about a change for other women also. So we try to have a conversation with them and understand how it was made possible, as well as ethnographic tools that we all know about, which includes participant direct observation, case histories, or personal diaries, among others. Now, I said we have quantitative, we have qualitative, but now, as we all know, the norm of the present time is to do a mixed methods. So the mixed methods combine qualitative and quantitative data collection. So it is well planned out in the design of the study, in the implementation of the study, and even in the analysis. And these are helpful in triangulating data, identifying complementarities, discovering paradoxes and contradictions by using a combination of the existing methodologies. And though there are a lot of examples available, I would like to highlight the GAP project, which has used a combination of quantitative. They've used mixed methods, and you can see the richness of the GAP project stories that have come out, especially which focuses on the labor and the gendered patterns of work. Similarly, there are other examples, like we have the Gender Inclusion Toolbox by CCAPS, ICRAF, and CARE International surveys also, which use a mixed method. So the bottom line is mixed methods provide us more detailed understanding of the situation, of the conditions, of the constraints, of the opportunities that women face, and also through conversations, it also gives us an idea from the voices of the women themselves, and how these constraints or barriers, can be converted into opportunities. So they have some very good reasons of how they can actually turn them into opportunities. So that's why the mixed methods is using a combination of both qualitative and quantitative data collection is a very good methodology to understand gendered work patterns. Now, let me highlight some of the methodological issues that we found out during our review, especially for measuring work patterns. The first one that I would like to talk about is reporting, which is self or proxy. So if it is a self-reporting, it's very easy and we can get all the information. But majority of the time, in most cases, it happens that somebody else responds on behalf of the responder. Most of the times it could be the head of the household, and in that case it is the male member of the household. So women sometimes or many times do not get an opportunity to talk to the enumerators in these quantitative or even semi-structured interviews. So this actually kind of will not give us a full picture, does not give us a full picture about the amount of work that women are doing, and also the types of work that they are engaged with. So thus, you see that there is undercounting or underestimating of the women's work patterns, not just in agriculture, but also in the household, domestic, and allied activities. Another important methodological issue. And so how do we overcome this self versus proxy reporting? Yes, so it would be very interesting if it would be very interesting and also easy if we could try to ensure that both the husband and wife are available, both spouses are available at the time of conducting this survey, and also checking with the women, to see that she also can express her views if the social and cultural norms permit. A second methodological issue was work versus employment. And as I have said, most of the times women's work is not taken as employment. In this case, employment, actually, they look at it as something that gives them profit, that gives them a monetary return. And so that's another issue, a methodological issue that we need to try to overcome so that we are able to account fully the work patterns of both men and women. And also we have the unpaid family work, the casual work, temporary work, seasonal work. So these are also some of the methodological issues that we need to focus a little more. There are not many tools and methods that are available that focus on this. And so I think, how can we understand these and make the methods or the tools that are already available more sensitive to this, which allows us to collect this kind of data also, is what needs to be thought about. Later in the presentation, Greg will also talk about recall bias and care and domestic work. I will not be touching on that now. Now, I would also like to mention some of the recent innovations for the labor or work pattern measurements, and especially COVID-19 has taught us some very important lessons. So which actually I think are very, very have been very useful for us, in our own work also. So the COVID-19 has amplified the need for different modes of data collection that can be used to monitor labor market changes, because of mobility restrictions and face-to-face interviews not possible. And so phone-based surveys, so using digital technologies, especially phone-based rapid labor surveys. So when I say rapid, you can understand that they happen very fast, but they happen quite periodically also, so that we are able to monitor the work patterns of different communities. And this can be either in the rural areas or in the urban areas, whichever will. So this allows us to reach many people and location, geographies and all that. But the only limitation I see is that how many women can actually take the phone-based surveys. That is a big limitation, I say, because many rural women still do not own a phone. Forget about a smartphone, they may not even have access. They may not have a simple phone also. And even if the household or the family has a phone, we are not sure whether the women can actually have access to that particular device at the time of the survey. And this phone-based technologies have been used extensively during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also there's another interesting survey by NIDS CRAM, which more details are given in our paper, which you can read about. A second innovation is the big data, using big data, which is also very similar to where you use phone-based data also, but these are less intrusive, they are less costly, and you can cover spatially and temporally. So there is more granularity in the data. But again, the limitations, as I've said, with the digital tools continue to be there for women. And so how many women can actually use the digital technologies, or how much of data can big data also harness is still not very clear, but it has a lot of potential and opportunity. Another important thing, another innovation that we could see is that is using social media, other types of online behaviors. For example, this may not be directly related to work patterns, but still they would actually give us some idea about the behaviors, especially like, for example, people, employment dropout rates, people missing out on employment, etc. This you can see from the social media. And also there's a lot of data that we can actually harness from Twitter that also give us some idea about the labor work patterns, and here again we can look at both men, women, young boys, young women, etc. So this is another innovation that we can tap about. And lastly, I would like to say analysis of the existing data in new ways. Again, that's an innovation. And a very recent paper by Alain Dijambry and others, a 2020 paper, which actually uses seasonal labor calendars. So when I mentioned seasonal calendars, I said, yeah, I'll come back to that. And this is what I meant. They use seasonal labor calendars to construct quantitative data and to understand seasonality in employment. So there are, you see that there are innovations in the type, of analysis of existing data also. So that's also very interesting. And I think these can be harnessed. And I think we also, as CG researchers, as social scientists, we should start thinking about putting our heads together to see what are other innovations that we can actually think about, especially in understanding gendered work patterns. With this, I would stop, and I would now like Greg to take over from here. So over to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you, Padmaja. Thanks. So I'll try to keep my part a little short. I know we're gonna run short of time, I think. Fitting, I guess. So I'm gonna start, I just wanted to start with talking about, some of the two most common methods for collecting time use data. There are others, qualitative and ethnographic methods that Padmaja has already mentioned. But the two most common methods for collecting time use data are really stylized questions. So when respondents, these are the types of questions that are asked, like, how many hours did you spend on a certain activity over the last 7 days? The reference period can obviously vary. And then there's time diaries, in which respondents either record for themselves, so they're self-recorded, or as part of a survey interview, they're asked to report on all of their activities during typically the last 24 hours. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each of these, which I've summarized here. Stylized questions are typically more straightforward to implement. They can, although not always, involve shorter interview times. Some key disadvantages are, so you don't get the full picture of people's activities. You're only capturing those activities, those specific activities that you're asking about. And then in this kind of aggregated frame, asking about the last 7 days, it's impossible to kind of tease out simultaneous activities. Time diaries are much better suited for capturing the simultaneous activities, which we know a lot of women's activities, a lot of unpaid care and domestic work, falls into that category. time diaries also, you're obviously then able to get kind of the full picture of the activities, at least for that reference period. That, the disadvantage is that they are more complicated to implement. It really takes skilled enumerators to do it well, and to do it without leading to longer interview times. So these are sort of the basic elements of both of these methods. In practice, there's a lot of variation in how these are implemented. Reference periods, question phrasing, the number of activities asked about, even elements like how the information is recorded, especially for kind of like the time diaries. If it's recorded in a paper log, it's or with a smartphone, for example, which is something we'll talk about later. There's a lot of variation in how they from one survey to another. Next slide, Padmaja. So I just wanted to touch on establish the methods, and now I'll talk about a few key methodological issues that we go into detail about. A few of these in the paper, and I've pulled out some of three actually to talk about here. So the first is recall bias. So respondents, especially with time use data collection, it's an issue. So respondents may not accurately recall how much time they spent doing a particular activity, or they may not. They may struggle to accurately aggregate time spent on activity over the recall period. So if we're talking about the last 7 days, you may have instances where you worked in the field for this many hours on this day, then maybe it wasn't as many hours on the next day, and that task of aggregating is complicated, especially in during a survey interview. What do we know about recall bias? So there's research on this from psychology on the cognitive aspects of survey methods that that tells us that the extent of recall bias should depend on the length of the recall period. So longer recall periods leading to greater bias, but also on the regularity of an activity, how frequently it occurs, and then how salient it is. So activities that occur irregularly and are not very salient tend to suffer the most from recall bias. And so in theory, a lot of activities in rural households fall within either of these two categories. Tedious agricultural activities like weeding, or mundane domestic activities like cleaning the house and certainly at times, but not all the time, childcare. Empirical evidence, on this is mostly limited to high-income countries. So one of the research gaps that we highlight in the paper is a need for research comparing on recall bias and other methodological issues oriented in low and middle income countries. So the next issue is activity classification. So time use surveys in low and middle income countries tend to utilize shorter, customized lists of activities as opposed to the standardized classification systems like the CADIS used by the UN that's followed in high income countries. So this is a problem because the inconsistency in the activities reduces comparability across contexts, but also limits the scope of analysis. So aggregating activities, related activities into a few categories, we often think of this as a way to reduce interview length and enumerator burden. And while this certainly may have been true back when we used paper-based surveys, we don't know if it's still true with CAPI surveys. And so nested menus, for example, make it possible for enumerators to easily and quickly navigate complex lists of activities. Yet the norm, at least in what I've seen, is still to use fewer activity categories. The downside of this is it limits what we can learn from the survey. So if we aggregate all ag activities into a single category, it doesn't tell us anything about the gender differences in the types of the agricultural activities that men and women engage in. So ideally, the more categories we include, the richer the findings from that. And so again, but we don't really have any evidence on empirical evidence on this relationship between the number activity classification and interview length. And so that's another area where we'd like to see more research happen. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. The last issue I'll talk about is related to care work. And so we know this is one of the major drivers of gender disparities in time use, yet it's incredibly difficult to measure. So the range of childcare activities engaged in over a course of a day is often irregular, involves frequent switching between multiple activities, and many of these activities are undertaken while you're doing something else. So this means, from what we know, what we already talked about, that childcare can be prone to recall bias, and given the simultaneity of issue, then unless the survey is specifically set up to capture this, childcare is going to be vastly underreported. In addition, respondents may not think of childcare, particularly passive supervision while you're doing something else, as work. And so this can also lead to underreporting. And there's different ways to address this, like priming respondents to increase the salience of childcare, and as well as asking direct questions about were you caring for children while you did this. But the fact is we don't really know. We don't know what works. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we don't have the kind of rigorous experimental evidence that would allow us to compare between different methods to say, okay, this method, time diaries using priming reduce, underreporting of childcare by X amount. We don't have that, and we need it. So, okay, I have just one more slide. So if we can go to that, and then, actually, okay, never mind. I have 2 more slides. So I wanted to, before I conclude, I wanted to touch on a few innovations innovative methods that we see. So one issue is that we're starting to see some more methods that expand kind of the scope of time use studies beyond just the hours and minutes. So the Oxfam Household Care Survey that I've linked here does a really great job of this. And if I would encourage anybody, like all of you, to follow the link and look at it more closely, but it does get more into not only the time spent by different household members on various activities, but respondents' preferences and perceptions around the division of labor. We have some new work that I'm part of on measuring time use agency. So kind of the how does time use and control over time relate to agency and empowerment? And then there's some great new work coming out on the ag and nutrition linkages based on combining time use data, time diaries, with data on food intake and physical activity trackers, accelerometers. And then lastly, there's with the influx of mobile phones in low and middle income countries, it's opening up a lot of new potential data collection methods. And so there's a new study from last year, I guess, that where they used intermittent phone-based surveys to better understand seasonality in time use data. And then there's from a few years ago, and we're getting ready actually to test this as well. There's a really nice pictorial-based smartphone app that's been developed for self-reported time diaries. Okay, so I know we're over time, but let me finish up with the next slide. So kind of pulling all this together for both, what Padmaja talked about and then what I did. The problem isn't really that there are not methods for measuring work, employment, and time use in ag. It's more that there are so many methods for measuring these things that it's hard to know which one to use. So our hope is, one of the primary goals of the paper is that it can be a guide for researchers to figure out which method is best suited for your particular research question. In addition, we wanted the paper to shed light on evidence gaps and shortfalls in current approaches. And by doing so, we hope that it can also kind of catalyze methodological improvements and new data collection efforts. And in this vein, I'll end with kind of two calls for future work that I've already alluded to a little bit. First is a hope that more attention can be paid to the conceptualization and measurement of aspects of work, employment, and time use beyond simply how many hours or days people spend working. So I think of this as kind of broadly encapsulated in the idea of quality of time in contrast to quantity of time. So this relates to kind of the current discourse on decent work and drudgery, how time use relates to women's empowerment, and also kind of these new insights on ag and nutrition linkages provided by energy expenditure data. And then last is just to reiterate that what we really need is we do need more rigorous methodological research, ideally utilizing experimental designs to compare different methods for measuring work and time use in low and middle income settings. And importantly, there needs to be funding for this work, which is often kind of hard to come by for measurement-oriented work. So there's certainly been a surge in measurement papers in the last few years, but there's still, there's still more need. And Padmaja and I have alluded to throughout the presentation, there are still many open research questions that really need this sort of research to answer. So thank you. Here's our contact information, and then look for the paper available soon on the Gender Platform website. We're very happy to answer questions at this moment too, I think. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg and Padmaja, for the excellent presentation and for the what I think will be a very useful review for, as you said, helping researchers figure out, among all of the different tools that are available for measuring time use and labor dynamics, what is the most appropriate tool for them. And that's what we really hope to be able to support with this paper, and also all of the tools and methods that you've collected, having those available for people to be able to filter and search for those and be able to find tools that make sense for their research activity. I'm going to turn it over to questions for now. We didn't get a lot of questions coming into the chat box. Hazel has a comment here, and I would like to see if, Hazel, maybe you want to elaborate on your comment.
Hi, thanks. Thanks everyone. Well, thanks to Padmaja and Greg for the presentation. I just kind of raised this point when Greg was talking about recall bias, just to emphasize that the cognitive burden, he was kind of talking about this issue about not being able to recall the correct amount of time within a particular time frame. That's really why say a 24-hour recall works better, because I can easily, or anyone can easily remember yesterday as opposed to over a period. But just to mention that it's not just a burden for the respondent, but also for the enumerator to record it, because whenever there's difficulty with the respondent being able to aggregate or even identify what the appropriate sort of events, how do we call it, instances of an activity, right, over the period are, they kind of need to help translate that in, record it in the questionnaire, be it on paper or on a tablet or whatever. And I think on this experience I was sharing about the AWAYA pilot, where we did both like a stylized question on time use around work activities for 7-day recall, and then also did the usual kind of 24-hour recall. Having both experiences, the enumerators really complained a lot about the 7-day recall and saying, like, they don't know what to say, the respondents, and then the enumerator also doesn't know, kind of struggled to help aggregate. And what we found is that the teams that were more educated, like enumerators who were more educated, kind of didn't, or more numerate, didn't really have the same difficulty as the ones that had, just lower numeracy in general. So it could really interact with capacity too in terms of your data collection. So that was the only point. So thanks.
Thanks, Hazel.
Can I just add on to what Hazel said?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree to what Hazel has said. And yes, 7-day recall is really burdensome for the enumerators also. And in addition to what you mentioned, Hazel, about the, where enumerators are more educated, also we found that, if the enumerators have established a very good rapport with the communities and they know a little bit about the culture, the socio-cultural environment of the community, it helped them, in asking these questions. Like, for example, if they also they knew that in that particular community there was a festival that happened 4 days before or 5 days, so they would kind of like relate, what did you do on that particular day? Like there was this Ganesh festival, so what were you doing? So that also helped, so you could see that some enumerators were not so much burdened by these because they have these different characteristics also. So that also helps sometimes. So it also matters, I think so.
Thanks. I had another comment and question about the recall bias issue, but I see that we've gotten another question in the chat that maybe you want to respond to first. Ramya, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or should I go ahead and read it off? I can, if you could unmute yourself and ask, that would be great. Otherwise, I'll read it.
Thank you so much. I was just curious. I think in the first slides they presented, the presenters showed that there's recall bias. There's also, like, you're measuring household unit level, not necessarily getting an unpaid work. Is there, based on this work that's been done, is there a push towards, at least for future surveys, future labor force and LSMS surveys, to gather unpaid work as well as, ask women rather than head of household or other units? Thank you.
So maybe I can respond and then Ananya and Greg can add. So yes, Ramya, thanks for that question. And yes, there is now a more, there is this commitment, especially the labor force service, and I think also the LSMS also, to specifically take account of this unpaid work, the domestic work, the reproductive work. And so there is this renewed commitment. And so yes, there is a push to have a protocol or a tool that will allow us to collect this kind of information. And secondly, depending on the socio-cultural norms, where we actually can ask the women to respond on for herself and not somebody else responding to her. Again, as I have said, if the enumerators have established very good rapport and they kind of like fall within the communities where they are working with, and they're accepted, this could be possible. We tried to do a small experiment with the VLS villages where we have established a lot of rapport with the communities, where one set, we had the same questions being asked to male respondents alone, and then the same question, and some households we asked the women alone about those questions, and we found that the responses were quite different. So that was another methodological issue that we had to handle to see, which data, how do we triangulate that data that we got. But yes, there is a lot of push now to ensure that, paid work, unpaid work also is actually reported and recorded. So I think there will be advancements, and I think each one of us can start testing using simple methods also.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that too. I know the LSMS group has recently launched kind of a new, it's so separate from the LSMS ESA, but there's the LSMS Plus surveys that they're rolling out. I don't know that they do. It's worth looking. I think they do get a more kind of individual level data collection. I don't know if unpaid work has made it in there. But the same group does have some. They do have some. There's a paper I think that just came out by led by Gayatri Kuwal and others that looks at individual, like self versus proxy reporting for labor measurement. I don't know if, again, I don't recall offhand if it included unpaid work or not, but there's that group is certainly, I know from talking with them that, I mean, this is something they would, I mean, if they had their way, they would do everything would be individual level. They would talk to not in like all respondents from the household. So I mean, they're certainly pushing for that. I just don't know if it's not always feasible.
And just to add, there is a very recent paper by Dicenza, a 2021 publication, where they also talk about these, that these limitations are well recognized, and they present some efforts, ongoing efforts, I think so. So it would be good if we can read that paper also.
Great, thanks. We have another question that has come in about how we align time use questions to make them comparable across regions. Sonia, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify or add anything to your question?
Thanks, and I'm glad I could be part of this discussion. Very fascinating to hear the results that have come. I just wanted to exactly understand, how do we make data points comparable, particularly when patriarchy and other social norms may play a very important role in women's participation in data collection. And we have seen this happening in NFHS too, where women do not respond to all queries, and there's a strong, the male-headed households really play a very important role in determining the economic decision-making indicators. So how do you feel you'll be able to align the paid and unpaid related contradictions in the survey tool? And how do we administer it better? Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's a very good question. I alluded to this a little bit in the presentation. I think this is a huge issue when it comes to kind of the unpaid work, especially childcare. And so I think there's particularly, I think there are at least potential kind of methodological or like survey things we can do implementation wise to level the playing field kind of, and so I discussed some of these, like priming and asking direct questions about childcare. That same approach, you could, if there's other activities that where you think the gender norms are really at play, I think those similar approaches could be used. I also think this is something where if that's not so that's like the perception kind of issue is part of it. I also think in terms of making things more comparable, the more detailed we can get in the activities that we're asking about, I think will also can also help to address kind of the comparability issue.
Maybe just to add to it, and I don't know, this can't be a common practice also, but in the study where we used accelerometry, especially, where we were actually trying to measure the energy expenditure, and we had in each household, one male member and one female, that is the couple would be wearing the accelerometry devices. So we could actually get how much time and how much energy was being expended in a day, because it records for every 5 seconds. Simultaneously, we also asked a 24-hour recall question on, what were they doing from the time they got up, so that was like the time use questions we were asking. And we tried to match these two to see how much of comparability is there between what was reported in the time use questionnaire versus what came out from the accelerometry devices data. So we could see actually whether what the women were saying or whether there was somebody else reporting on the basis of the women. We were trying to test that. So we are still in the phase where we are trying to match it, but I don't know, it might show up some results which could be interesting, but that's just a point I wanted to make.
Great, thanks. We've got a couple of other questions that have just come in. One is from Catherine. Catherine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Actually, mine is more of a comment about the activity classification. I saw that we have a standardized tool that is for high-income countries, and so I'm wondering, why are we in the pipeline of developing one that fits LMICs, or are we still going to try to, standardize ourselves with high-income countries for activities? Thank you.
Great, and I'll read the last question that has come in, which is also very specific about whether there are different time use tools for men versus women. And since we have only 3 minutes left, I think we'll have to conclude with the responses to these last 2 questions. Thank you.
Thanks,
Go
Liz.
ahead.
And for the questions. So to answer the last one first, I know I haven't seen, I don't know of any work that actually compares different tools for men and women. You can certainly think that, you know, I can see some, I mean, it would be interesting. I also can see how they might be problematic, but and so we do have some work that coming up that we'll be able to compare, that we'll be able to actually make comment on this, where we'll be comparing across different methods and then men and women as well. So we'll actually, we should have an answer to this, you know, over the next 2 years, say. We have some field work next year. On the activity classification question, just really quickly, I mean, the landscape right now is that there's no, you know, outside of these, like the UN classification that Europe has, there's a classification system used in Europe as well, and some others. But outside of those, there's no standardization at all. If you look at the kind of like the time use surveys that even at the, you know, some of these are, you know, project level, but there's also, you know, a fair bit of national statistical agencies in low and middle income countries that do implement time use surveys, and there's really no classification, like standardization at all. So I mean, I agree, this is a need, but this doesn't, this isn't an issue actually that I see brought up that much. I mean, in addition to the activity classification, there's also kind of like respondent. You have to like samples and respondents you have to consider for comparability as well to make sure. But no, I mean, the unfortunate answer is no, there's not anything in the pipeline that I'm aware of, but I do think there should be. So thanks.
Thanks, Greg. I think with that, we will conclude this webinar for today. I would just want to thank the participants for sharing this review with us, and to let all of you know that we will be sharing this recording and posting it online, and the paper that the presenters have shared today will also be available soon on the website, so we will share that with all of you as well. So thanks again so much for joining, and we look forward to the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.